report and figure out where you went, you can't get it out of that box.
Good morning.
You get it out of there. Yeah.
My name is George Sanchez, and I'm going to start you off this morning. I'm from the University of Southern California. Welcome to our second day of the conference, Fixing a Broken Immigration System, Historical Contemporary Perspectives on Reform. Today we have, this is the first of three panels that we will have. After this one, we'll finish around 11 a.m. We will have a coffee break, and after the second panel, there is a luncheon with the keynote speaker, Jorge Castaneda from New York University, and we'll finish up with a final panel in the final round table in the afternoon, and should be finished around 4. So it's a full day. I want to get us to get started. I will be moderating the session, and for those of you that weren't here yesterday, it'll be very much like yesterday's session. We've asked each of our 4 panelists and our 1 respondent to take no more than 15 minutes. I'll be giving them little signs at the appropriate time to have them move on. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers just before they speak. In this morning session, we're going to focus on questions of incorporation. Our first panelist this morning is Gary Gerstle, one of the organizers of this conference, who's the James G. Stallman Professor of American History at Vanderbilt University, and is currently co-directing Immigration in the American Experience, a year-long interdisciplinary faculty seminar at the Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities at Vanderbilt. He's published 6 books, more than 25 articles, many of them focused on questions of American immigration, ethnicity, and nationality. His book, American Crucible, Race and Nation in the 20th Century, won the 2001 Salutis Prize for Outstanding Book on U.S. Immigration and Ethnic History. Gary.
Thank you very much, George. Good morning, everybody. All moving a little slow today. I also regret having set a pattern for running such a stern set of time limits in the panel that I chaired yesterday, and now I have to live by my own poison. I was trying this morning to get my own remarks down to 15 minutes, and we've all gone through this process. You will be the beneficiaries, even as, meaning the audience here, even as we suffer. I want to talk about a form of incorporation that I call political incorporation, which I define very simply. Political incorporation refers to the process through which immigrants and their descendants come to think of themselves as Americans with political rights and with a voice in politics, should they choose to exercise it. I want to make these 4 points about processes of political incorporation, and because I am a historian, much of my remarks today will be historically inflected. My first point is that political incorporation has been central to this country's history. If we take the long view, we can regard the successful political incorporations of tens of millions of immigrants as being one of this country's greatest achievements. In fact, one could argue that the United States has incorporated as many people in absolute and relative terms as virtually any other nation in the world in the last 200 years. So if we take the long view, we can regard political incorporation as a great success and as reason to be optimistic about the future possibilities of incorporation. My second point runs contrary to the first, in the sense that political incorporation has rarely been an easy, conflictless process. And I want to emphasize this because in some of the mythology we develop about past immigrant incorporation, we tend to think of the process of past immigrants incorporating as being easy and effortless and without conflict. To the contrary, political incorporation has been hard and full of conflict, especially as groups of native-born Americans have attempted to deny immigrants incorporation or the fruits of that incorporation. My third point is that the common attempts to deny immigrants incorporation has often led in the past either to outright exclusion prohibition on immigrants becoming citizens, or to a form of second-class citizenship that following May 9 I will call alien citizenship, which I think is a useful term, and I'll expand more on that later. By alien citizenship, I mean people who are citizens but still have the experience of being aliens, cultural and political aliens in American society. And my fourth point is that these efforts at exclusion or subordination of immigrants have made what I call transformational incorporation central to the successful integration of immigrant populations. I contrast transformational incorporation to what we might call acquiescent incorporation. Acquiescent incorporation means immigrants submitting to prevailing patterns of American politics, culture, and society. Transformational incorporation means immigrants altering, disrupting, and sometimes transforming those patterns in ways that allow newcomers to truly embrace the United States as their own. Host societies think they want acquiescent incorporation. Host societies say if we're going to admit all these immigrants, they should just take us as we are. And this is not just true of the United States. I think it's true of a lot of countries around the world. I want to argue that transformational incorporation, even though this may sound counterintuitive, actually produces deeper and more enduring forms of integration and patriotism. So let me put a little flesh on these conceptual bones, drawing from American history. First, I want to, this may be familiar to some of you, but maybe not to others. I just want to go over some basic laws that have excluded large groups of immigrants from the possibility of becoming citizens. The first Congress of the United States passed a law, the 1790 Naturalization Law, excluding non-white immigrants from naturalizing. The law said that in order to naturalize, you had to be free and white. This law excluded black immigrants from naturalizing until 1870. It prevented Middle Eastern Arab immigrants from naturalizing in the early part of the 20th century. And it prevented East and South Asians from becoming citizens of the United States till 1952. In other words, this law passed in 1790 was on the books until 1952 for 3/4 of the history of the American Republic. And the law represented a denial of the most elementary form of incorporation, the opportunity to become a citizen. By alien citizenship, I refer to those who have been admitted to citizenship, but then experience a disjuncture between their formal rights and status on the one hand, and their experience of those rights and membership in the American polity on the other. When May was writing about alien citizens in her book Impossible Subjects, she had Japanese and Chinese Americans in mind, those who had been born in the United States and were thus citizens, but who suffered very, very deep and often insurmountable discrimination. To those groups, I want to add other groups who experienced forms of alien citizenship. I would add Mexicans. I would add Eastern and Southern Europeans, for example, Italians and Jews. And I would even add the Irish of the 19th century. In addition to these groups being designated as racially suspect at one time or another, they were also identified as religiously different and thus potentially subversive. Being Catholics or Jews, these groups were Catholics and Jews in a society that saw itself as deeply Protestant and on a mission to reclaim the world for a particular kind of Protestantism. The experience of alien citizenship provoked a variety of responses. Quiescence was one response, hyperpatriotism was another response, and transformational incorporation was a third response. It is this last that I want to stress, although if I was presenting this whole paper to you, I would probably devote equal attention to each of these. One example of the transformative form of incorporation that I want to draw your attention to is the 1930s labor movement, whose ranks were full of immigrants and their descendants. Irish, German, Italian, Jewish, Polish, Greek, Arab, French Canadian, Mexicans, and others, united by their poverty and marginality and by their conviction that as Americans they deserved better. These working-class ethnics took seriously the first principles of the Republic, freedom, democracy, and opportunity, and infused them with new meaning. Freedom now meant the right of a worker to speak his or her mind at work or cast a ballot for a Democrat at the polling station without fear of reprisal from management. Democracy meant ending the regime of autocracy at the workplace and replacing it with one in which workers had a voice in the conditions of their labor. Opportunity only had meaning, these trade unionists argued, if poor workers and their families had access to government-guaranteed forms of assistance that would cushion the effects of unemployment, illness, the loss of a breadwinner, and old age. Ethnic workers mobilized not just in unions but in politics. Millions of immigrant Americans and their children voted for the first time in the 1930s, and many of them cast their votes for the Democratic candidate Roosevelt. They not only helped to carry him to victory in 4 elections, but helped to shift the balance of power in the United States from conservatism to liberalism, and from a politics that glorified the free market to one that celebrated the role of government in regulating a capitalist system that seemed unable to right itself. Regardless of whether one supports or opposes the politics embodied in what came to be called the New Deal, one has to concede that it wrought major changes. Immigrant and ethnic voters were a key constituency in this transformation. These voters also began to engineer a significant reorientation in American conceptions of belonging by insisting that Catholics and Jews had as great a claim on the United States as did the descendants of those original English settlers who had wanted to make the United States a Protestant land. The New Deal did not self-consciously promote religious pluralism or multiculturalism, and it did not describe its supporters as a rainbow coalition of different ethnic and racial groups. Indeed, in important ways that I and others have written about, the New Deal reinvigorated older cultural and racial prejudices. The groups pouring into the Democratic Party were a diverse lot, however, and their very presence began to disrupt accepted ways of defining and of representing the American nation. One sign of this was the delegitimation of racial barriers to citizenship and of prevailing forms of alien citizenship, including Jim Crow. The labor movement and Democratic Party upheavals of the 1930s and 40s deserve to be seen, then, as an example of transformational incorporation. So do, I would argue, the multicultural upheavals of the 1970s and 80s that substituted an ideal of cultural diversity for one of cultural homogeneity as a defining feature of America. I want to argue that these upheavals over the long term have actually strengthened the integrative capacities of American society. In our current moment, obstacles to the political incorporation of earlier waves of immigrants are often overlooked. Those obstacles rendered political incorporation a more complex and fraught process. George, did you hear that? I get one more minute?
Got it.
Now, where was I, though? So, okay. Well, it was interesting. The present. Okay, here, draw me back here. Those obstacles rendered political incorporation a more complex and fraught process than we generally recognize it to have been. From this perspective, we can begin to see how an incorporative process that not only promised inclusion, but that also held out the hope of transformation, that allowed, even encouraged immigrants who became American to become advocates for changing America, could generate unexpectedly powerful cultural and political affiliations. It gave immigrants reason to believe in the idea of America and to engage deeply in its democracy. Such belief and engagement have solidified the incorporative process. Those worried about the incorporation of today's immigrants, in addition to underestimating the complexities of past incorporation, commonly identify 4 issues that they regard as new. First, that the new immigrants are more different from Americans than past waves of immigrants have been, an argument strongly associated with the work of the political scientist Samuel Huntington. Second, that the United States has never confronted a problem of illegal immigration on a scale that we face today. Third, that our global age has rendered the pursuit of citizenship an instrumental process devoid of incorporative meaning. And fourth, that the institutions that once guided the incorporation of immigrants have declined and that no replacements have arisen to take their place. I have things to say about each of these issues, but only 3 minutes left. So I'm going to take up only one, and that is the issue of instrumental citizenship. We should never underestimate, even in this global age, the incorporative energies that immigrants' engagement with American democracy can unleash. This is abundantly clear in the experience of immigrants 100 years ago, who often thought that they themselves were acquiring citizenship for instrumentalist reasons. They thought of themselves, and these are immigrants in the 1920s, as acquiring citizenship to protect themselves and their communities from nativist efforts to stop the teaching of foreign languages in schools. They thought of acquiring citizenship to end their vulnerability to deportation. They acquired citizenship to reverse restrictive legislation barring additional individuals from their home countries from ever entering America. And they acquired citizenship to end their exclusion from desirable jobs and careers. In the process of acquiring citizenship and fighting for their rights as citizens, however, many of these instrumentalist citizens of 100 years ago deepened their engagement with America. To take one example from that earlier period, the 1928 struggle to elect Al Smith, the son of Irish Catholic immigrants, President of the United States, electrified immigrant communities throughout the country. They wanted to be part of an America that had chosen an Irish Catholic and a member of a new American family as their leader. They believed that America would become a different place, and their home were that to occur. Or to take an example from our own period, my city, Nashville, recently witnessed a hard-fought struggle over an English-only ordinance mandating the exclusive use of English in all official city business. A broad coalition of pro-immigration forces defeated this ordinance by a wide margin. From a distance, this defeat might be regarded as a victory for the right of immigrants to be foreign and different. It can be interpreted, after all, as their right not to speak English. But from close up, it is clear that the struggle brought together many different groups in the Nashville area, some immigrant, some native-born. It is also clear that the struggle itself and the participation in a broad coalition of groups that it entailed have enabled many more of Nashville's recent immigrants to believe that the city could become their enduring home. The net effect over the long term may well be to promote rather than stymie the spread of English fluency among the city's foreign-born population, and to accelerate rather than to retard immigrant incorporation in the city. I am not suggesting that we are at the cusp in Nashville, any more than in any other part of America, of an effortless absorption of immigrants into a pre-existing America. Incorporation is rarely effortless, and it is rarely a one-way process. It requires not just changes from immigrants, but changes from America, too. This two-way process is not, however, a process to be feared. To the contrary, incorporation often works best when it is dynamic, even dialectical. Thank you.
As I was sitting here and looked at the panel, I realized that the panel makes up a lot of people who I have long histories with. Gary was my teaching assistant back when I was an undergraduate at Harvard. Our next speaker, David Abraham, is the one person I've met for the first time yesterday. He is a professor of law at the University of Miami. He received his BA and PhD in history from the University of Chicago and his JD from the University of Pennsylvania. The author of The Collapse of the Weimar Republic, he has focused his legal scholarship on labor law and policy, legal theory, and the development of the politics of rights in the U.S. and Germany. He is currently working on a comparative study of the gains and losses resulting from the transformation of citizenship in an era of neoliberalism.
Thank you, George. If there's one thing that's been clear almost from the first moment of this conference, it's that the question of immigration cannot be separated from a study of the nature of the societies that are absorbing immigrants or rejecting immigrants. We talked in particular, and we'll talk more about the labor question, but more broadly, the question of the nature of the social order internally is an integral part of the discussion of immigration policy. So this paper the actual paper is about America, Germany, and Israel, three modes of citizenship and incorporation, one reflecting U.S. low, another medium, Germany and Israel, high levels of social cohesion, all of them operating and changing under worldwide conditions of neoliberalism. In this period, the United States reflects what I might call a congenital liberalism, Germany a struggling liberalism, and Israel a failed liberalization. So two paired questions that have risen to the top of the agenda in these prosperous countries of the North are, first, who belongs to the national political and social community of the we? And secondly, what does belonging entail in the way of rights and obligations? Under the impact of an unprecedented wave of free mobility for both capital and labor, which has been called, most often been called globalization, which very much very similar in many ways to the early 20th century, which witnessed mobility of labor and capital. The labor and crises of the social welfare state that have taken place during the same period. The borders and bonds of citizenship have been changing and, for the most part, weakening. At the same time, there's considerable connection between the intensity or thickness of belonging, what the Europeans today are calling the issue of social cohesion, of being a citizen of a particular country, and the intensity of the process of incorporating newcomers into that country. Each of the three countries that this paper is about has had a certain historical path, and all future policy is, as we've long said, is path dependent to a certain extent, but all of them have involved both exclusion and integration, boundedness and incorporation. Very roughly speaking, and the paper is much more nuanced, I hope, than what I'm going to have time to say now, we can say that there is something of an inverse relationship between the ease of access to citizenship and what citizenship offers. Thus, of these countries, citizenship is easiest to acquire in the United States, but is of less social and economic value and offers less of a premium over mere legal residence. Hyphenated Americanism has offered a relatively viable integration strategy for most groups and fits into a dominant ideology of a weak state and a pluralistic society. And this is part of what accounts for what has been a, generally speaking, highly variable rate of naturalization amongst those eligible. So some groups, Korean immigrants, for example, naturalized in the 80% area, others, Mexican Americans, only in the 30s. Germany, in turn, has until very recently had a very restrictive immigration regime, offering permanent admission and prospective citizenship on only a very selective, largely ethnic basis, and has had a difficult time integrating foreign-born residents. Neither the multiculturalism which liberal forces in Germany supported a generation ago, nor the explicit integrationism of the current period has been especially successful. Time permitting, I'll say something about the reforms of the last half dozen years. On the other hand, entrance into Germany's social market society offers a panoply of social and economic rights not contemplated in America's free market liberal individualist society. So German guest workers have not, what as they used to be called, were not available as objects of hyper-exploitation in the same way that we might worry that guest workers in the United States would be. Finally, Israel, one of the few remaining explicitly ethnic democratic states, once boasted an extraordinarily thick and egalitarian model of citizenship, coupled with intense transformation of newcomers into natives. In recent years, however, Israel has become far more liberal. I'll have much more to say about that if I am able, and less Republican, small r Republican, with much more citizen diversity and extreme inequality beyond even American levels. Within its Jewish population, and for a brief moment beyond it, Israel had become a considerably more multicultural and more capitalist country. Openings to non-Jewish population have currently shut down completely, of course. Liberal democracies today are based on and offer three kinds of rights, as we've long talked about them: civil, political, and social. Toleration creates civil rights that limits the sovereign's power and reduce fear of the ruler, while, however, sparking anxiety about what one's fellows may be up to. That's the classic problematic of liberalism. To move onward from civil to political rights requires the establishment of trust, namely the confidence that one's fellow citizens or one's fellow nationals or one's fellow residents will not use their rights to promote ignorance, evil, severely bad decisions. That's the problematic of democracy. Finally, social rights demand a social solidarity, the willingness to engage with and assume duties on behalf of others, fellow citizens who may or may not contribute as much or need as much as they draw out of the system. This is the problematic of the welfare state or social democracy. So toleration, trust, and solidarity are not simply institutional and not simply a matter between ruler and ruled. They require a software, so to speak, of a political culture that creates a nation of compatriots in order to construct a we. Shared identities, overarching identities, are more difficult to construct or maintain in a world of multiplied identities. Liberal philosophical efforts like Rawls's to establish an overarching consensus model or Habermas's to propagate a constitutional patriotism, grounded in kind of ahistorical, largely legal procedural values, though admirable, have proven problematic, particularly in countries with significant ethnic and cultural divides. Creating cultures of solidarity and integrating immigrants into such a culture are difficult tasks, and they've been approached differently by each of the three countries. So now let me be a little bit more specific about each. Are you serious? Okay, let me say almost nothing about any of them. Okay, so I don't want to be naive about the United States. Years ago, there was an article in an early number of New Left Review by Goran Thurborn, who argued that the United States had become a liberal democracy only sometime between 1964 and 1968. So my comments in the paper are not meant in any way to derogate the discussion of otherness, discrimination, exclusion, etc., which other members of the conference will have talked about at greater length. But that said, the experience of the United States of a demos of a we, in which people have a voice and feel a shared sense of solidarity and community, is built around a relatively easy-to-join civic identity, notwithstanding all of those exclusions. American-style civic nationalism has potential to create a level playing field for free individuals, but it's unsuited for the solidarity of social justice. Most American rights are negative liberties, and they are accorded to all persons rather than to just citizens. Indeed, the term alien citizenship that has been invoked today is being used to describe the maximization of rights for people who are not legally speaking citizens, but to maximize the human, social, and other rights of people who are not citizens but aliens in the country. Okay, second, Germany. Some thicker sense of identity and social cohesion is the burden of German history. The central goal of reformers after 2000 was to facilitate integration into a more capacious German identity and society. So citizenship divorced from ethnicity was the goal of the reformers, to institute just solely birthright citizenship, to facilitate naturalization, making it much easier than it had ever been before. And lo and behold, contrary to all the expectations of liberals and leftists in Germany, didn't happen. It was made much easier to naturalize, and the process did not lead to the flood of naturalizations that was expected. So as Germany becomes a thinner society, and the social welfare, social market economy that we identify post-war Germany with, as it recedes, we may find it easier for Germany to incorporate non-native populations. Finally, a few very brief words on Israel. Israel, of course, is an egalitarian, Spartan society for 40 years, organized around a levée en masse, a shared new language, changing names, us-them view of the world, a certain secular messianism, a kind of Greek polis sense of agency and equality, an extreme melting pot model of immigrant incorporation featuring absorption centers, etc. After 1977, this dramatic model broke down completely, and the Labor Party of quasi-universalist secularism gave way or was punished by the rise of parties of religious, poor, subaltern, darker-skinned Jews combined with illiberal Russian immigrants, which created a world of Jewish multiculturalism previously unknown in Israel, while the enlightened elites have abandoned homogenizing state-building Fabianism in favor of global capitalism and mobility. So expats, for example, from Israel who used to be disdained as traitors to the common cause are now viewed as assets abroad and part of the diasporic force of Israeli culture and society. And anyone who's been on a law school or economics hiring committee lately will know that they are the largest commodity available. At any rate, as part of their part of the global neoliberal academic environment. So the rollback of Israel's settler society, welfare state, and the triumph of a kind of meritocratic individualism has deprivileged immigrants within Israel while introducing, for the first time, previously unknown, guest worker and even illegal foreign worker regimes. At the same time, immigrant incorporation has become more pluralistic there, with diversity becoming a mode of rather than an impediment to integration. So immigrant group identities there that would previously have been impossible, Ethiopian, Russian, above all, enjoy a level of collective recognition politically and culturally that would have been anathema to the previous regime of incorporation. Whether in the three countries examined in the paper, neoliberalism and the politics of recognition contribute to a greater measure of social justice and individual freedom remains a highly contingent and uncertain matter. But it's certainly true that both natives and immigrants have a stake in whether the social cohesion of their immigration regimes survives the current period of neoliberalization. Thank you.
Our next speaker and I have been friends for 28 years. Arturo Vargas is the executive director of the National Association of Latino elected and appointed officials. He also serves as the executive director of the Nalel Education Fund. Previously, he was vice president for community education and public policy at the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. A nationally recognized expert in Latino demographic trends, electoral participation, voting rights, the census, and redistricting. He earned his BA in history and Spanish and an MA in education from Stanford University. Arturo.
Thank you, George. To give you a sense of how long he and I have known each other, when we first met, his hair was brown and I had hair. That was 28 years ago, and since then we have been following this issue of political integration of the Latino community. And one of the things I like to, well, first of all, mention about my organization is that our mission is actually to promote the political participation of Latinos in American civic life. And so this is something that I do every day, day in and day out. And what I get paid for is to make sure Latinos participate in our society in some way. And if I could use an analogy from my very favorite television show, Star Trek, what we have seen over the past decades has been steady progress in terms of Latinos incorporating into the body politic of this country. But there have been moments when we've gone into warp drive. And I'd like to talk about two of those moments in warp drive and suggest that right now we are witnesses to our community being at warp 3. I hope there are other trekkers out there and it's not lost upon you. Let me go back to the 1990s. I'm going to talk about just about the last 2 decades and what has spurred, in my view, Latino political integration, especially immigrants. Much of it spurred on by efforts to not incorporate Latinos into the American body politic, anti-immigrant sentiment, efforts to actually exclude Latinos from this country. I point to 1994 as a key milestone in Latino political integration and that was the year of Proposition 187 in California. That probably was one of the most anti-immigrant pieces of legislation ever proposed in this country. It was a popular initiative on the ballot, passed by the voters, ultimately ruled unconstitutional. What it did is that it excluded basically any public benefit, education, healthcare, anything, to anybody suspected of being an undocumented immigrant. What that created was an environment in California where Latino immigrants took upon themselves to act and react to what was being said about them and the legislation that was being passed, both in the state of California and nationally, because that created the space, Proposition 187, to allow Congress and Bill Clinton ultimately to sign into law a welfare reform measure that denied benefits to legal permanent residents. What that created was a reaction in the immigrant community to fight back. And the way they fought back was to seek to have a voice in public policy. And the way they did that was to seek naturalization. What we saw over the course of the 1990s, particularly in California, was 1 million Latinos seeking naturalization. To give you an indication of what this meant at a personal level, one of those new citizens in the 1990s was my mother, who immigrated from this country in 1952. And it wasn't until 1994 that she took it upon herself to attend one of my organization's naturalization workshops. This was before I started working at NALEO. Just one Saturday, she decided she was going to do it. She went to a local public school where we had set up volunteers, and she filled out her naturalization form, had her interview, went through the process of swearing-in ceremony, at which point I asked her, and this was all in Spanish, I asked her, why now? Why did it take 42 years for you to become a U.S. citizen? And without missing a beat, she said, because I want to vote against Pete Wilson. Pete Wilson, who had championed Proposition 187 for his re-election prospects in that year. But that was exactly the sentiment that thousands and hundreds of thousands of other immigrants had, that becoming a citizen, in essence, was an act of self-defense. And my mother has not missed an election since. In fact, the following election, she voted to legalize medical marijuana. And she hasn't missed an election since. She's following these elections very closely. But it created an energized electorate in California. When we talk today about California being a blue state, if we were to really analyze who are the Democratic voters of California, we will have seen that it was this new generation of naturalized citizens who were pushed away from the Republican Party by the proponents of 187 into the hands of the Democratic Party. I am not one who subscribes to the notion that Latinos, therefore, are a permanent element of the Democratic Party's coalition. They may be there now by virtue of the dynamics, but they have shown in the way they have behaved in other elections that they very much will sing to other candidates and other parties. Let me fast forward to 2006, where I think we have experienced another moment of accelerated political integration of the Latino community. So maybe we're at warp 5 now. In 2005, we had the Sensenbrenner bill that would have criminalized unlawful status in this country. That was the impetus, the catalyst for immigrants themselves to want to have their voices heard. And if you all remember the protests and the marches of 2006, when millions of people in this country took to the streets of America's towns and cities in numbers never before seen and not seen since, all asking for an opportunity to participate, for justice, and ultimately for comprehensive immigration reform. And it was a sense of optimism. I don't know if anybody here were actually involved in these marches. But it was an opportunity for the immigrant community to engage in an act of civil participation never seen before. And one of the major tools that allowed that to happen was Spanish language media and Spanish language radio, which helped mobilize immigrants and share messages. And in fact, technology was an important tool in organizing. Cell phones were all the rage, and texting each other, young people texting each other about gathering at the city hall to do a protest on the Sensenbrenner bill. Just spontaneous protests. So much so that English language media, this was lost upon them for the first months of what was going on. The first massive mobilization, for example, in Los Angeles occurred right outside City Hall, and close to 1 million people came together to protest what was going on, literally outside the front door of the Los Angeles Times, reporters of whom had no idea what was going outside their own building. And it was because this was something organized completely within the immigrant community, using Spanish language media. Oblivious were the English language media at the time. But that changed, obviously. What we tried to do in terms of my organization, working with other organizations at a national, state, and local level, was to then channel that enthusiasm, that sense of activism, into impact. And we knew that with elections coming, that we needed to expand the Latino electorate. And there was an opportunity here then, having seen what happened in 1994 and that reaction. And I know there's a matter, anti-matter analogy here that I can use from Star Trek as well, but I haven't quite figured it out yet. But in a perverse way, the more that immigrants are pushed against, the more they push back in ways that we have seen of political integration. So in 2007, we took it upon ourselves, working again with Spanish language media, to message the point that in order to continue the progress that we have seen, in order to continue people's voice and integrate into society, we needed to become citizens. Those eligible needed to apply for citizenship. So our goal was to inspire at least 1 million legal permanent residents to apply for citizenship in 2007. Spanish language media saturated the television, radio, airwaves, and print. We have print partners in this. We had a national coalition of organizations at all levels, everything from individual attorneys, school districts, churches, community-based organizations as service providers, helping people through this process and apply for naturalization in 2007, knowing that we had a moment where we had the attention of the community and wanting to participate. In 2007, 1.4 million people applied to become U.S. citizens. In 2008, 1 million people had made it through the process in time to vote in November 2008. And for the first time, the single largest ethnic group to naturalize that year were immigrants from Latin America. 22% of all new citizens were from Mexico alone. Rarely had Mexico been the source country of the largest number of naturalized citizens in any single year. That occurred in 2008. We continued this work and trying to build upon what we had seen in this activism, and we continued messaging about the importance of the 2008 elections, wanting to make sure that Latino voters and Latino immigrant voters, those naturalized citizens that we knew were going to vote because they didn't take it for granted, would participate in November 2008. But we began early in the year, knowing that we wanted these voters to have an impact on the primaries, and in fact they did. This is something I think that has been lost among many political observers of the impact Latino voters had on both the Republican and Democratic nomination campaigns. Latino voters in many respects defined the campaigns for both political parties before even going into the conventions. If you recall, John McCain's campaign was not doing well going into the Florida primary. In fact, if he had lost the Florida primary, he probably would have been forced to drop out of the race. In the Florida Republican primary, had no Hispanic voter participated, had no Hispanic voted in the Republican primary, Mitt Romney, exit polls suggest, would have won by about 16,000 votes. Would have carried Florida, probably putting him on the road to the nomination. But because John McCain was able to get over 50% of the Hispanic vote of the Republican primary in Florida, he won that election by over 100,000 votes, putting him on the road toward the nomination. On the Democratic side, we all know that Senators Clinton and Obama went to the very end of the calendar of primaries, competing for the nomination, all the way, in fact, to Puerto Rico. They campaigned in Puerto Rico in the Democratic primary. First time in presidential politics history that candidates go to the island of Puerto Rico asking for votes. They did so because Senator Clinton's campaign was able to continue her momentum because she was able to win some key states with huge Latino support. States like Texas and California, Arizona, New York, Florida, and others, even in the state of Illinois. She split the Latino vote with Barack Obama. So she was able to sustain her campaign in many respects because of the momentum she had from Latino voters who gave her support in the primaries, up to then where she dropped out of the race after the primary season. So we had an impact as Latino voters on both sides of the aisle. And in November, there were at least 5 states that went from having been won by George W. Bush in 2004 to Barack Obama in 2008, where arguably the margin of difference was made up by the support of Latino voters. States such as New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, Florida, and Virginia. So we had an impact on those elections. We're now preparing to continue that and trying to determine how we're going to sustain this momentum. Because one of the elements of encouraging and sustaining political integration is making sure that we continue to have a sense of urgency in terms of people wanting to participate. Our next opportunity to have an impact will be the 2010 census. And this will be, in our view, the most important census for the Latino community. It will be the first census in this country, for example, in which Latinos make up this nation's second largest population group. The Census Bureau well knows that it cannot accomplish its mission of having an accurate census if it does not accurately count the Latino population. But the challenges to counting this population are enormous, challenges we have not yet encountered in any other previous census. Not only is this population large, about 47 million in stateside, but it's dispersed. Not only does the Bureau need to count Latinos in California and Texas and Florida and Illinois and New York, where they've been enumerating them for decades, admittedly not well, but they now have to enumerate Latinos in states like Tennessee, in states like Arkansas and Oklahoma and Nevada and Utah, when we do not yet have the social service infrastructure on which the Census Bureau so much relies upon to identify those trusted messengers who will convey to immigrants and to others and to low-income people that the census is safe and confidential and something that we need to participate in. So we have some enormous challenges in making sure that we incorporate Latinos into the census. Our mission or our goal is to continue this momentum that we saw with the marches. That just as we were able, using Spanish language media, to mobilize millions of people to take to the streets and to have a voice, and then inspire 1.5 million to apply to become U.S. citizens, get 1 million through in 2008, have 9.7 million Latinos vote in the November election, a historic number, just a shadow of what could have been, because 21 million Latinos were eligible to vote in November 08, but 9.7 did vote, so we have a lot of work to do. We want to continue that same momentum to ensure that everybody understands that being counted in the 2010 census is the next step on that empowerment journey. Because from that then will come the opportunity to create new congressional state legislative districts where Latinos will be able to elect candidates of their choice. Presumably, policymakers will be more accountable to Latino immigrant communities, and then create an environment both in Washington and in state capitals that are perhaps not as hostile to immigrants as others. And I am done and even save my minute for the next speaker. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Take it.
Dow Myers is one of my favorite colleagues at the University of Southern California, where he is professor in the School of Policy Planning and Development. He's also the director of the Population Dynamics Research Group and serves as the co-director of the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration. His newest book is Immigrants and Boomers, Forging a New Social Contract for the Future of America. He has a PhD in urban and regional planning from MIT, and he also studied demography and sociology at Harvard and earned a Master of Planning degree from UC Berkeley. Dow.
Thank you, George. I think he's going to wake this thing up.
He needs to get woken up again.
Richard. Well, good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here with you this morning.
We'll have to move.
At USC, we have a saying that assimilation is a two-way street. Immigrants aren't the only group that has to adjust to American society. American society also is adjusting. It's a two-way accommodation. But that really requires that there's a public will for that kind of accommodation. And that's really what I'm going to be speaking to for the most part this morning. And in particular, I'm driving off of the baby boom generation, which is rapidly aging, regrettably so. And we'll soon get a promotion to higher status, and eventually will retire, and who will replace them? But I'm getting ahead of my story. There's really two narratives that are out there. I'm just going to go right to the narratives, because time is short. The predominant narrative in America today is the narrative of dislike. People really want to go back to 1970. They don't like accelerating immigration. These people weren't invited. They're not assimilating. They're not needed. And there's too much population growth anyhow. And that's a story that is fed through the news media. And it's accepted. This story is accepted by over 2/3 of Americans. And here's an example. These ads ran every day for 90 days before the presidential election, all about how 100 million more people due to immigration is going to raise your gas prices. It's going to run out of energy. Even T-Boone Pickens can't solve your problem. The water's going to run out. These are L.A. Times, New York Times. I don't know where the money came from exactly, but there was a lot of money poured into these ads. They were almost a full page. I can't get them on the screen here. I apologize. They're bigger than this, but you get the idea. But it comes down to this word here, which I color red. What does that really mean? Illegal, unauthorized. I think it's the sense of not invited, not permitted, and undesirable, and certainly not needed. And if that's the attitude of the American people, there's not going to be a lot of accommodation. But I think we can look at this and see whether that's true or not. Here's an interesting picture from California. Voter data among the white voters, asking them a question. On the whole, would you say immigrants are a burden, or would you say immigrants are a benefit? And I broke it down by liberals versus conservatives. And of course, the conservatives are more likely to think that immigrants are a burden than are liberals. And that's the data for 1998. And here we go from 2004. And liberals had lightened up. Only 29% now thought they were a burden. And conservatives went the other way. So you wonder, what's going on here? Are these people not reading the same newspapers? Are they not watching the same TV shows? This is the polarization of America, and it happened in just 6 years' time. It's really interesting to me. But the good news, I think, is anything that happens fast can be unwound fast. If this was a 50-year trend, I'd be much more discouraged about the prospects for reversing it. But that polarization is an interesting phenomenon. I think that they're reading the same economic trends very differently. So there's two narratives. Now here's the second one, and I'm going to propose this is the one that's more useful. The one you usually hear is there's the pro-immigrant narrative is to be fair and to give immigrants rights. And the anti-immigrant narrative is, well, they're not invited and illegal and, who asked for this? Well, there's a third one, I think, which is, in terms of immigration reform, not as popular among advocates, but really maybe more popular with the mainstream voters, so it's worth considering. And it's one that's very selfish and self-interested. As the thesis of my book goes, it's all about self-interest. And what are our needs, and how do immigrants really fit in? Turns out that the first narrative is faulty on every point. Immigration, as I'll show you in a second, is not accelerating. It's been steady, and in fact has been declining in California since 1990, in the U.S. since 2000, and in the last couple of years, dramatically declining. But it's not accelerating. Although you'll still hear from restrictionists, immigration at record levels. It's not record levels. It was record levels earlier. We peaked and it's subsiding. And these not invited people are labor volunteers who are coming to fill jobs where there's demand and not assimilating. Have you looked at the data? They're extremely upwardly mobile. And I'm going to show you one area in which they're most upwardly mobile, which is the one you never hear about in the news media because it tells the wrong story. But it is the American dream story, and I'll show you the data on that. And then further, we got to talk about those baby boomers. The critical impacts of aging of the baby boomers, and what does that mean for our needs? In terms of population growth, well, we'll come and we'll look at that. So I turn it around. It's not about immigrants. It's really about us. It's about baby boomers getting older and this thing they call the baby boomer tsunami. Now, I don't use that word as trivially as it oftentimes is used. I mean it quite literally. This is a literal metaphor. Now, a tsunami wave, those of you who have never encountered one, and God forbid you should, it isn't that high. It's not any higher than that ceiling there. And if you're out in the water and a wave comes along like that, which we do in California, occasionally you see a water and you hyperventilate and say, oh my gosh, you just have to go out and dive under the wave, go down and come back up the other side, you're okay. A tsunami, it's not the height of the wave. The problem is the tsunami goes back from the beach 1.5 miles, so that you can't dive under a tsunami. It keeps coming and coming. You've seen the videos, right? In Thailand, it just comes ashore like a freight train and keeps coming and coming. That's the baby boomers. The baby boom lasted for 18 years. When the first one crosses age 65, it keeps coming and coming. It is virtually a tsunami, and so it's a very appropriate metaphor. What we're facing now is 2 decades of 30% increase. I'll show you how this works out. I did some historical analysis. This is it. This is the ratio of seniors age 65 and older divided by working age. Now, I've updated the definition of working age. It's not 15 and older. That's an agricultural, agrarian concept. I have a postmodern one. It's age 25 and older. You know, most of our kids aren't really worth a lot under 25. So 25 to 64 is the new one. But back in the olden days, the good old days at Ellis Island, there were 100 seniors for every 1,000 working age people. And so that's that ratio there. More recently, in the last 4 decades, we've been stuck at about 240 seniors per 1,000. It's been constant. Anything that's constant for 4 decades, I assure you, people think is totally normal and permanent. And you cannot imagine anything different. So here's what's going to come in the next 10 years. Now remember, I'm a demographer. And so I get to do this rocket science stuff of looking at in the room here and saying, okay, in 10 years' time, you're all going to be 10 years older. It's basic stuff, but it actually adds up. So you don't deny me, right? So here's the ratio. Here's what's happening in the next 10 and 20 years. That ratio goes up 67%. Now, that's the problem. This is the problem of America. The Obama administration is wrestling with it right now. First, let me show you. It's in every state. The state that has the lowest increase is Oregon. That's 50% increase. That's the lowest. It's everywhere. The baby boom is everywhere. You can't duck it. And it leads to all the problems that we have. Social Security and Medicare, we all know about that. But it also leads to this incredible workforce replacement crisis as we try to turn over the personnel, and taxpayer replacements as our major taxpayers retire and start to draw benefits instead of paying in. And then we have additionally home seller crises and education infrastructure crises. It all drives off of this baby boomer 67% increase in that ratio. That's the big problem in America. And the reason we don't talk about it a whole lot is because you can't stop it. It's coming and you can't stop it. Don't know what to do about it. Bush administration ducked it. Clinton administration ducked it. Obama comes in and he gets everything. Everything falls in his lap simultaneously. And foolishly, maybe he's taking on everything. But it's all intertwined. You can't separate the things. Here's the labor force trends. They're slowing down dramatically from what they were in the 70s and 80s, current years. And it gets down to like 0.4% growth in labor force. California is doing better than the average, which means other states are below the average. It's going to be a brutal battle for workers for all these companies and public sector agencies. The likely responses are multifaceted. These are all going to happen, every one of these. Reduced growth in GDP because that drives off of labor force growth. There's going to be delayed retirement for seniors. That's already underway. There's going to be reduced and delayed senior benefits, already underway. Higher taxes, not yet happening, but definitely going to happen, have to happen. And 2 good news items, I think, at the bottom, which I colored green for good. There's going to be a rediscovery of our neglected minority youth. My assumption is that the reason we've neglected people, allowed them to drop out of high school and not really care a whole lot, is because in the 1970s we had a surplus of kids coming of age with the baby boomers. In the 70s we had a glut. We allowed people to drop out of society, go to communes in Oregon and all that stuff, or send them off to Vietnam, fighting wars, or park them on college campuses. We had too many people. Well, now it's reversed. Now there's a shortage, and in that environment you can't let anybody drop out. And I think it's going to change the social policy in America as we rediscover this. The only question is how fast can we make this realization come true? And then, by the way, what about those immigrant workers? How does the perspective on immigrant workers change when you realize that there's a 67% increase in the baby boomer ratio? Well, to make it really personal and to do it differently than other people do it, like I don't want to talk about Social Security, you all know the story. But what about your house? What about the most personal thing to voters in America? Their house values. This is what happens to the rate of home buying and home selling by age. And young people buy homes more than they sell. They sell them because they're moving up to the next home. After age 60, roughly speaking, people start selling more than they buy. Baby boomers are now at, well, just about age 64 right now. They're crossing that line and will begin to sell more than they buy. Here's my projection for one state. This is California for 1 year, 2020. And I did it ethnically here. And this is the number of net sellers and net buyers. And you see the gray-haired people, that's the white population there, are selling off. There's a number of Mexican-American homeowners, though, longtime homeowners in America, in California, who are selling off also at old age. And the buyers here, predominantly Latino. And the big question in California is, can these Latino buyers afford to pay us the $1 million prices that we want to sell for? And that's a challenge that needs to be confronted now, because you can't make these changes overnight. You have to actually cultivate future home buyers, and it takes time to cultivate them. You have to put them through school, basically, and you need to pay taxes to cultivate them, or else your house values are in jeopardy. But this is a new message people have not heard, and so they actually pay attention to the home buying thing. So can immigration help? Well, according to the dislike narrative, not at all. You cannot reverse aging, they say, and immigrants get older too. And then they point to some long-term Social Security projections, and in 80 years' time, it'll all work out. Well, that's true. I'm not waiting that long. Our problem is the next 20 years. I mean, it's a serious problem, the next 10 years even. And 80 years from now, it will all work out. I believe that's probably so. But it's only after we flatten everybody in between. So according to the other needs, or excuse me, our needs narrative, I calculate that the immigrants help by about 1/4 to 1/2. They can't solve the whole problem by themselves, but they're an indispensable part of the solution. And so I did some calculations with recent Pew Hispanic projection data, and I give a citation there for where I got the data, because the text in their report doesn't make it out as rosy as my calculations. It's their data. And when you look at it, how much would the senior ratio rise without immigrants? And the problem would be 29% worse if you didn't have the immigrants in the next 20 years. And in over 40 years, it'd be 47% worse. So the way I look at it, and the level that Jeff Passell assumes is 1.5 million a year, if you preserve 1.5 million per year, you dampen this problem that we're going to have otherwise. And if anybody thinks we don't have a problem, then they don't know the basic arithmetic of aging. And I would challenge anybody who would try to restrict immigration to tell me, then how are you going to solve the problem? Are you going to raise taxes? Are you going to cut benefits for seniors? What are you proposing? Put it on the table. What's your plan? It's not immigrants or nothing. It's immigrants or these other solutions. Which one is it going to be? So when it comes to immigrants, I got to convince you, I think, about those other points. I don't need to convince you, but I should share the information here. Is it really, immigration really accelerating or not? This is the rate of increase, percentage increase for the U.S. since 1980, and it peaked out in 2000. It's going down slightly. And here's California, as I said, peaked in 1990. Here's New York. It peaked and is dropping. There's Florida, where I'm from, and it's still going up, and that doesn't make sense because I'm from Miami, and it's going down in Miami. Now, there's the Miami data right there. So that growth in Florida is in Central Florida, Orlando, or Northern Florida. There's Texas. Texas went flat early on because of the oil bust, and then it boomed, and then it's gone flat. And there's L.A. County. L.A. County actually has fewer immigrants arriving today than they did in 1980. It's really slowed down. So if you have fewer new arrivals, does that mean you have less immigrants? No. The immigrants are still there, but it's an accumulated population. Here's historical and projected data by how long people have lived in the U.S. The gray bar at the bottom is recent immigrants. This is the share of the total California population. It got to be 11% of all Californians were new arrivals in 1990, and since then the share has been dropping and continuing to drop. And what you have instead is the red zone growing at the top there. Those are the long-settled immigrants. And the long-settled immigrants are the ones that have all the great benefits for us because they're the ones that are really have been incorporated and are economically producing at great levels. I'm short of time. Let me just show you the homeownership stuff. This is for the U.S. That's the foreign-born homeownership lines going down as a percentage of households, and then the native-born is going up. So it looks like immigrants are doing badly. Not really, because there's more and more newcomers. You need to track each immigrant arrival wave and see how it does over time. Here's the newcomers, 1970, and their homeownership rate does that over 30 years. And here's the newcomers of 1980 and of 1990, and here's the newcomers again in 2000. Everybody starts off low, and the upward trajectories are extraordinary. But that's for the whole U.S. It might differ by state, so I'll show you 6 states. Here's California, New York, Texas, Florida, Illinois. Immigrants rise dramatically in homeownership everywhere. Some states are cheaper, and so they start off at higher homeownership to begin with. In New York and California, they start off lower, and they work their way up. But that's a message you don't hear. The upward mobility into homeownership is extraordinary. Mexican immigrants in California, after 30 years, 60% are homeowners. That's the American dream being actualized. So they're a big share of all the growth in homeowners. I'll just skip past this. In the U.S., there are over a quarter of the growth in homeowners now. And when you ask the question, who's going to buy your house, thank God we have some Latino immigrants and other immigrants who can do that. Oh, by the way, the Latino immigrant with a college degree instead of a high school degree pays 64% higher prices. So when you wonder who's going to come knocking on your door, you know who you want. It's the person you invested in with your tax dollars. So this is a way of building a common bond across the population between the new arrivals, the new immigrants, the old immigrants, and the native-born population who wasn't so sure they liked these people, was afraid that they were running out of control through the ceiling in numbers, weren't assimilating, all that. And in fact, those are all not facts are not true. And by the way, you need a mirror and hold the mirror up to yourself and see what are your own needs. And I reduce it all in my book to the social contract here. It's generational social contract that basically, kids take a lot of money. You pour money into schools, but then, miracles of miracles, kids grow up. They become replacement workers. They become future home buyers, taxpayers, and it's a cycle where people can, people can move into retirement years knowing that they're going to be supported by the next generation. So, thank you.
Thank God for the 2 Chinese immigrants that just bought my house in Irvine. They allowed me to move to Long Beach. Very personal for me. Our commentator, respondent this morning is David Gutierrez, who's a professor of history and director of the Latino Studies Research Initiative at UC San Diego, where he has taught since 1990. Educated at UC Santa Barbara and Stanford University, he has taught at the University of Utah, Stanford, and the California Institute of Technology. He's a former research fellow at Princeton and the Woodrow Wilson Center. He's the author of Walls and Mirrors, Mexican Americans, Mexican Immigrants, and the Politics of Ethnicity, and the editor of the Columbia History of Latinos in the United States since 1960. He also was both my peer at Stanford and my mentor. Thank you, David.
Good morning. It's great to be back at the center and see old friends. I had a couple notes on my comments here. I got significantly different versions, longer versions of these papers, and so probably focused on some different things than were emphasized today. And then also, I needed to alter my comments somewhat this morning because there was so much overlap between what was said in yesterday's panel and what has been presented here this morning that I wanted to incorporate into my comments. So a brief overview of what we've heard today. Even in a short time, Gary has provided an excellent thumbnail sketch of the challenges and achievements of the historically uneven process of immigrant political incorporation. And just as important, in my view, the different ways they engaged in and expressed what he called acquiescent and transformational politics, a distinction that is often missed in discussions like this. Similarly, David deftly handled the equally daunting set of issues in his comparison of modes and methods of incorporation of non-citizens in three very different contexts, although I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more of his insights on the even more vexed question of Palestinian citizenship within his conceptual and theoretical frame, particularly in comparative context. Arturo also did a great job boiling down many of the challenges we are going to have to grapple with as our society continues to be transformed in fundamental ways by the ongoing demographic revolution that Dal just talked about as well. As he suggests, while we have seen great strides in the past couple of decades in the emergence of a pan-Latino middle class and the slow but steady rise in Latino political participation and political incorporation more generally, a great many questions remain about both about incorporating the millions that currently do not, for whatever reason, participate in U.S. electoral politics, and the millions who continue to lie outside the embrace and protection of U.S. citizenship. And finally, with this presentation, Dal just did a really insightful analysis of the immigration issue in the context of all us gray-haired people starting to slip into the sunset.
Ain't no sunset.
Yeah. But I'm going to play my usual role of pouring cold water on many of the optimistic projections that we've heard this morning. Using my colleagues' presentations as a point of departure, I'd like to try to push the discussion forward here by pushing and integrating some of the larger historical and macroeconomic questions that were raised yesterday, but I think that we touched on too lightly in all of our presentations here today. To do this, I think it's first necessary to step back and give some sober reflection on the current moment as it relates to questions addressed by this panel and the conference more generally. More specifically, I'd like to constructively contest Gary's claim that the presence of 12 million undocumented persons somehow represents an anomaly in the historical trajectory of immigration and in the different processes of immigrant incorporation over the course of the nation's history. Of course, in terms of the sheer magnitude of the issue, it's difficult to quarrel with Gary's argument. As we all know, the question of the presence of such huge numbers of officially unauthorized persons within the political jurisdiction of the United States has been the third rail in domestic politics for years now. And it obviously continues to color discussion of a broad array of issues ranging from the purpose and function of the 2010 census, as Arturo talked about, to the debate over health care and by extension other tax-supported services, to the question of who actually should enforce the slippery notion of national sovereignty, federal authorities or agents of the state and local government. And ultimately, of course, as all our speakers have noted today and yesterday, the presence of this number of undocumented persons raises profound questions about the very nature, function, and meaning of the institution of national citizenship as an organizing force of modern or postmodern politics. But be that as it may, I'd like to suggest first that there is nothing particularly historically anomalous about this state of affairs, and second, that the current situation may well represent the new normal in the American political economy. Now, Gary is completely correct in noting how much the trajectory of the American immigration saga changed after the 1924 Johnson-Reed overhaul of the immigration system. Immigration from Europe dropped off dramatically, and from Asia even more precipitously. And with the onset of the Great Depression, the rise of the ethnic Mexican population, which had exploded in the first third of the century, largely in response to these developments, stopped and in fact declined with the great repatriation campaigns of the 1930s. But as George Sanchez noted yesterday, I think that it's high time that we dispel the persistent myth that the flows into the United States of massive numbers of unskilled laborers somehow stopped with the Great Depression. We need to remember that, in fact, this same practice was reinstitutionalized with the creation of the Bracero program in 1941 and 42, when the United States government allowed the reimportation of growing numbers of workers from Mexico, the Caribbean, and other places in Latin America, many of whom, of course, and this is important, were either the same workers who had worked in the United States before or their descendants and or neighbors. Now, most historians have depicted this development as an anomaly and have accepted the government's rationale that the program did not affect the permanent population of the nation because these workers were temporary contract workers. But this kind of view conveniently overlooks the fact that virtually all reputable historians of the Racero program note that for the entire life of various versions of the program from 1942 to 1964, the ratio of undocumented and at least technically officially unauthorized workers to legally contracted ones ran at least 3 to 1 and oftentimes approached 4 to 1. So my point here is simply to underscore something that was raised yesterday. The government essentially cooked the books when it came to the actual immigration and population numbers during the 1940s, 50s, and into the 60s. While official immigration and census statistics indicate modest rates of authorized migration and a steady decline in the officially acknowledged population of foreign-born persons in the nation, conditions on the ground actually reveal that throughout the period in question, the mass circulation of both officially authorized and unauthorized foreign workers had become a permanent feature of certain key sectors of the U.S. economy. This is a permanent condition that was established in the early 40s and has continued unbroken to the present day. In addition, this growing dependence on foreign labor tended to hide from view the existence and deepening both of the transnational social networks that help to sustain this constant circulation of workers and the growing dependence on highly mobile workers without reference to their nominal nationality or citizenship in many other growing economies of the post-war world. In other words, this is an international trend that was established after the war and something that has been fairly common since. So in my view, the population and labor trends that after 1970 represent not so much changes in kind, but rather in degree and magnitude. So again, the larger point here, as Gary noted of the 19th century yesterday, is that for virtually all of the 20th century, and increasingly after World War II, the institution of formal membership in society, commonly called citizenship, has always been in constant tension with a permanent diverse population of persons who, for whatever reason, did not possess citizenship of the nation in which they were working. Very identical to what the circumstance we face today. In other words, this kind of dynamic stasis and the presence of a large and growing permanent population of denizens of various kinds of legal statuses has been a common feature of life, not only in the U.S., but in other industrialized and now post-industrial societies. And this is really my central point here. As May Nye and others noted in yesterday's panel, while we have to recognize that much of the growth in recent historical immigration rates, and therefore of the foreign-born population, are direct outgrowths and derived artifacts of the extant principles of so-called family reunification, the other preferences in U.S. immigration law, and to a lesser extent, the exigencies of intermittent refugee and asylee crises, a huge proportion of immigrant flows and concomitant demographic shifts, especially the so-called undocumented or unauthorized population, are largely attributable to business as usual in the U.S. economy. The insatiable demand side Ruth Milkman laid out so clearly yesterday. And in a globalized economy, can it be any other way? I would submit that although we continue to fetishize the institution of citizenship, the real dynamic is American employers constantly seeking a source of labor that they can wring profits from at a rate comparable to the rate foreign employers are wringing profits from their workers. That's the game in town. And again, whether those workers are incorporated as citizens really is beside the point. In this world, a worker is a worker, however you dress her up. So to echo Ruth and others who have thought about this systematically, when we think of what the new normal has become over the past 40 years and more, and what may be normative as far out as we can see, and this is where I probably disagree with Dow, we have to acknowledge the organic relationship between large economic trends such as the routine downsizing of U.S.-based firms, the offshore outsourcing of production processes, and the increasing utilization of U.S.-based firms of labor sources abroad, and the simultaneous explosive growth, or insourcing, if you will, of foreign labor supplies, both at the high end of science, technology, and engineering, and, of course, as we see every day, and I saw again in my hotel room this morning, at the low end in the agricultural, construction, maintenance, manufacturing, and surface sectors of a radically restructured economy. Now, of course, much of the problem here in Washington is that you seldom hear this kind of analysis as a part of a serious policy discussion. There are obviously many complex reasons for this, but one of the most important is that if we did, we suddenly would have to acknowledge that the issue is not so much immigration or even unauthorized migration, but is rather the ongoing destructive trend of hyper-exploitation of all workers, regardless of citizenship. And therefore also, and this is crucial to our discussion this morning, the erosion of the institution of citizenship as a source of political power and a guarantor of rights, which is what David Abraham was pointing to. I'm right on, George. Thank you. In other words, it is much easier to scapegoat immigrant workers and hype the fetish of American citizenship and the sanctity of national sovereignty than it is to discuss the parallel precipitous decline in U.S. standards of living and the increasing powerlessness of working people, and not incidentally, so-called middle-class people as well, that have accompanied the latest form of capitalist economic restructuring. As a formerly proud employee of the University of California, I'm happy to report I just received a 10% pay cut after 25 years in the educational biz. So what has all this to do with the theme of the panel and the larger conference? Well, if, as I fear, the accelerating socioeconomic polarization we have seen over the past 4 decades has become the new norm, one has at very least to raise the question, incorporation into what and for whom? As all of our speakers have noted this morning, meaningful political incorporation and political participation, whether defined as Gary aptly has put it, either as acquiescent or transformational, have always been strongly influenced, if not completely determined and predicated, by class standing and by at least the possibility for upward socioeconomic mobility. And this is the central problem as I see it. And again, I'd like to hear Dowell's rejoinder. Whereas Gary, Arturo, David, and Dowell are completely correct in noting how the convergence of the golden age of broad-based growth and prosperity and the civil rights revolution of the period roughly between the end of World War II and the end of the 1960s did in fact open up unprecedented avenues for both meaningful upward mobility and political incorporation for populations that had largely been barred from both before. The convergence of social and economic forces since then indicate not only that something very different has happened since the beginning of the ongoing economic restructuring in the early 1970s, but that the concentration of power and resources at the top and the erosion of power and access to mobility at the bottom may well define the new normal for the current century. It seems to me that if we are serious about facilitating the incorporation of the currently unincorporated and in fixing what is broken about our intertwined systems of immigration and citizenship, we first need to grapple honestly with how these systems mesh or do not mesh with our system of economic production and consumption. Now, I obviously don't have the time to go into great detail about how we might conceive of alternative mechanisms of incorporation and membership, something I hope we can discuss in the question and answer. But I think whatever alternatives we develop would involve acknowledging and trying to rein in those forces of unfettered capitalism, the current system of flexible accumulation based on flexible exploitation that strips power from working people regardless of whatever nominal citizenship they happen or happen not to hold. As Ruth Milkman and others noted yesterday, We have already seen glimmers of this new kind of mentality in certain sectors of an admittedly shrinking labor movement. And for a very brief shining moment, as Arturo pointed out, I think we also saw something like this expressed by the mass movement of non-citizens a few years ago. Obviously, turning back the powerful economic trends that have undercut workers' relative position in society and undercut the value of citizenship at the same time will not be easy. But it is an absolute essential first step, in my view, if we are truly serious about facilitating incorporation and renewing some semblance of democracy in the current moment. Thank you for listening.
We have about a little less than half an hour for questions and comments. They're busy thinking and writing, so I want to open it up to questions first, and we'll take a few. There are microphones, so please wait for that. I'll take a few, and then we'll turn back here for comments. Yes, and identify yourself when you start. May.
May Nye. I'd like to hear a little bit more about this question of mobility, social mobility of immigrants. I'm thinking you're probably aware of the study that was published by Ed Tejas and Vilma Ortiz. Actually, Dave and I did a panel on that book last year, right? Generations of Exclusion, in which they actually, because they used the original samples, survey forms from a study done of Mexicans in Los Angeles and I think San Antonio in 1965. They actually tracked down those people as well as their children, and in some cases were tracking third generation because the people they interviewed were second generation. So they did a generational study of Mexican mobility. And what they found I thought was extremely disturbing, and it suggests, I think, questions that have, concepts that have come up in this conference as the neo-colonial relationship or the permanent segmented labor market, etc. And what they found was, despite trends of social incorporation or assimilation in terms of English language acquisition and even practices of exogenous marriage patterns, stagnation in terms of educational attainment and was it occupational or income? Both, right? Real stagnation. So none of this necessarily precludes buying a home. But I'd like to push on this issue a little more, because if in fact, and I think this was a sample that had a lot of integrity to it. So if in fact we actually see growing trends of kind of social incorporation, including home ownership, and yet, a permanent stagnation in terms of educational and income, that is, well, anyway, that's my question.
Take one more, and then we'll turn. Alan.
Alan Kraut, American University. Dowell, if you substituted Georgia, the Carolinas, and a number of other states which are sort of new entry point states for the states you used, what would that do to your trend in terms of percentage of foreign-born within the population, and what would it do to the home ownership data? Because it strikes me that a lot of the areas of the country that you cite were, say, 10 years ago, key points of entry and settlement, but are not necessarily the cutting edge the way these newer areas are. Dalton, Georgia, Garden City, Kansas, the various cities in the Carolinas, so on.
Okay, who'd like to start on the panel?
Let me, if I may. Well, first, with regard to the last question, I didn't show you the other slide for the new gateways. And there, the number of new arrivals increased like 600% in Georgia and North Carolina. And since 2000, they've gone flat. They're not increasing anymore either. So, and being newcomers there, they're not as far along in terms of home ownership, but they're on the trajectory. And certainly prices are lower there, so it's easier to get started. And that, so it doesn't, the overall thesis still holds. But the question that May raises about the Eddie Tejas and Vilma Ortiz book is a good one to raise, and it's gotten a lot of people's attention, and many of us have pored over it. It's a fascinating story where they found these lost survey forms because they're doing earthquake retrofitting in the basement, only in California, and discovered them, and then went back and tried to find the original people. Well, they didn't get all the original people, and one of the criticisms is that, I mean, they did it as good as they could do, but you can't track people down who kind of disappeared, and the ones who disappeared were the more upwardly mobile ones, they think. Also, women who got married and whose names changed, they couldn't track them down. And so there's a selective loss from the upper end, it appears. So that's one part of the technical problem there. There's also a difference between San Antonio and L.A., and the Texas people are far worse off than the L.A. people. But it's also interpretation, because these people all did much better than their parents, but they didn't close the gap with the white native-born. And I think the gap is what was really troubling the authors. The gap remained, and it's like the Mexican Americans were trapped in this permanent lower middle class status and weren't becoming doctors and lawyers, I think. And not to be humorous about it, but there was kind of a UCLA bias, and they thought that everybody should be going to the UC system and getting a BA degree, or you're a failure. There's a little bit of that. But George is going to be commenting on this very, very paper next week, and I figured, I don't want to hear now, George, save it for me, but I figured he's the expert on this. I'm dying to hear his reaction on that. But so it's intriguing what to make out of that study, because it is pessimistic. But I think that the consensus among the experts seems to be that they've colored their data more pessimistically than warranted. But the data are the data, and they're very rich, and extremely rich data. The book is it won a prize. It's well worth reading. So I thank you for raising it.
Any other, Gary?
I think I should offer some responses to David's provocative comment. Is this the time, or you want to go to additional questions? Yeah, now's the time.
Fire away.
Would not expect anything less from David than a tremendously provocative and incisive comment. Let me offer a few responses. One thing we agree on, I think, and that is we are in a new era of global capitalism that puts a lot of the workers who have to operate in this system, both in the United States and elsewhere, at great risk. This point was made very well yesterday. I think it's got to come up again in the next panel on labor and business responses to immigration. The question is, one of the questions for me is, when did this moment begin? And what I understood David saying is that it's rather continuous from the 1930s and 40s until today. And I think, while certainly in the Mexican case, I think that's true, I see a profound shift in the 1970s. And I also understood that's what the point that Ruth was making yesterday. Ruth can answer for herself, but I agree with that the moment of transition is the 1970s, which is also my way of saying that I take the New Deal effort at reform and at regulation very seriously. And it's not to say that there were not workers who stood outside the New Deal solution, but the 70s is important because that represents a restructuring of capitalism that involves undoing a lot of what the New Deal did. So I think one of the disagreements may be on where we locate the origins of the current moment, and my understanding is that we locate it in somewhat different places. We also, I think, may have some profound differences about the relationship of citizenship and social solidarity. Here I take David Abraham's point about the importance of solidarity seriously. I think I have somewhat different views about the presence or absence of social solidarity in the three societies that he identified. But I do think that for immigrants that historically citizenship has been a powerful tool for people living in societies where that status was granted or offered or made possible under certain circumstances. And it was a powerful tool because it allowed individuals both to make claims on the state or on elites or on their society about things they didn't have. And it was important as well because citizenship implies an equality of status that allows you to turn to the person to the right and the person to the left of you and say, no matter what differences we may have, we share a fundamental equality as citizens. And out of that equality can emerge a kind of social solidarity that allows us to pursue social justice and pursue equality and pursue things that matter to us. The really complicated part of making this case in America is that American citizenship simultaneously promised that equality while inscribing into the polity all kinds of inequalities grounded in race and religion, all sorts of exclusions. And so I understand the temptation to say that American citizenship is a fraudulent mechanism that simply doesn't work as a mechanism of social solidarity. But I have a somewhat different view of that. I think it does work as long as it's massaged and cast in a transformational as opposed to acquiescent role that allows rights imperfectly given and imperfectly distributed to be, through the agency of citizens themselves, to be more perfectly distributed and to become more meaningful. Now, one of the problems in talking about citizenship as a social solidarity is the question that I think David Gutierrez was pointing us to, which is one might say, okay, that's all right when most economic activity is organized within national boundaries. We can argue about whether that was ever the case. I think we can certainly say that that's no longer the case. And so what is the point of a solidarity grounded in a national form of citizenship? What is the utility of that in a global world where the critical flows go across national lines and any movement somehow has to take that into account? I think that is one of the million-dollar questions of our time. And my own not difficulties, but in thinking about this, it's not immediately clear if we premise that some sense of social solidarity is necessary for the popular enjoyment of rights in a globalized age, and if we take the nation out as an institution that is capable of generating rights-based discourses, what do we replace it with? You know, what then becomes the international basis of solidarity? And the powerful forms that are out there are not ones that I would elect to affiliate to. The powerful forms that are out there are religiously based international forms of solidarity, most powerfully demonstrated in Islam today and at earlier points in Catholicism and international forms of Protestantism. There's a lot of talk among historians and other scholars about the appeal of diasporas as places in which to live, which don't suffer the exclusions that nations inevitably tend to execute. But diasporas only tend to flourish in areas where there's a secure nation state confident in itself and willing to grant rights to all who live there, including dissidents and people who are different. A diaspora without that structure begins to look like a ruthless borderlands, a place without law and without rule where only the powerful can really get their way. So I don't have an answer to this, and I actually would invite David and others, who, if you think you do have answers or to this question, to put them on the table, because I think I think about this differently than you do, but I think that we share a common understanding of the dilemmas of trying to find forms of membership in the modern world that can generate the kind of solidarity that will produce the changes that I think we both would like to see happen.
David Abrams.
I mean, let me pick up exactly there. The nation state may not be either the integument for organizing social life and economic life that it once was. and it may not be the machine of transformation that it once was. But I tend to agree with Gary that we haven't achieved something else, and it's not the first time that the question was asked. I mean, the Second International of Socialist Movements met in Amsterdam, I think it was 1911 or 1912, in a moment of globalization, both of capital and labor and everything else, entirely comparable to what we have now. And the slogan is "Workers of the World Unite," and the message is "Go home and organize," right? And that construction of home is a very problematic process that we're talking about at the same time that we talk about the internal social organization and the entry by newcomers into that internal social organization. So I don't think that we can simply say that the issue of whether citizenship can be used as a rights platform for fighting free market hegemony, I don't think we can drop that as an antiquated question. I don't think we have a machine to respond to markets with that is not politics, and that politics is around the nation state still. Having said that, I think some of Arturo's comments indicate that in the case of the United States, well, several things. First, that multiculturalism can be a mode or method of incorporation, and it's not the opposite of incorporation. So your mechanisms for making people like your mother more embedded in and participating in revolve around Spanish language media, what today we call civil society groups, but accomplishes a process very similar to what we once disdained as melting pot models. I think your mother's story also incorporates the thinness of American citizenship. Americans are generally demobilized. I mean, why did she not naturalize for half a century? And the answer is she didn't perceive an imminent threat until Proposition 187. And I dare say that there have been a lot of very important things decided in the United States, alas, without your mother's participation or word being taken, before 187 and continuing into the future. But given the weakness of American citizenship as a counterweight to economic domination of elites, it's not entirely irrational that Americans don't think that much of becoming a citizen. And indeed, even now, the Mexican rate amongst eligible Mexican Americans is only about 40%. And it's a whole topic in itself, why Koreans are 85%, Mexicans are 40%, and I don't have the data or the equipment right now to pursue that. But it does testify to some kind of America as being about non-discrimination and equal opportunity. And indeed, most of our own discourse here is about reinforcing non-discrimination and equal opportunity. It's not about building a thick network of social protections. Germany, I think, demonstrates that it's harder to exploit workers in Germany, period, whether they're citizens or not citizens, Germans or not Germans. At the same time, it's much harder for Germans who have kind of historical, cultural, kind of Ernst Renan kind of conception of citizenship to make the transition, despite Habermas and the notion of constitutional loyalty, to an identity that isn't somehow deeply imbricated with this historical experience. And the left had conveniently for a long time available the argument that we're not giving Turkish long-term residents, after all 10% of the population, etc., we're not giving them an opportunity. That was a very good political argument to have. And then the laws are dramatically liberalized, and still there's no flood of people. So either the good news is that citizenship turns out to be less important in Germany than people thought it was, and so, like the United States, people do not see citizenship as a prerequisite to having a decent life, or we have to hold on and wait because the crunch will still come in Germany as it too adopts to less social protection and more international race to the bottom. Finally, I hope my comment to David in particular on the Israeli situation are not misconstrued. Israel has all along been an unstable ethnic democracy, not a liberal one, a social ethnic democracy, small r Republican society with very thick, very forceful integration mechanisms, very thick bonding of the citizenry. In that brief moment about a decade ago, in the emergence of what was called post-Zionist discourse, it moved briefly toward a kind of civic, liberal, democratic movement that would have been able to welcome Palestinian Arab Israelis as full-fledged members of a state of all of its citizens. That didn't happen, and it has, in my view, relapsed, actually more than relapsed, sunk further, I would say, into an ethnocracy. And there is, at this moment, no room for non-Jewish citizens to have anything besides minimal individual rights. But none of that is inconsistent with liberalization. In fact, it's not inconsistent with multiculturalism within a Jewish sector either. So there is economic liberalization, more individualism, more social mobility, more group identity, and all of that is consistent with a larger political illiberalism. So I think there's a lot of indeterminacy in the relationship between citizenship and what citizenship means and how powerful a lever it is, and both labor and social protections, and for that matter, other forms of liberal egalitarianism that we value.
I want to make sure we get another round of questions and comments before our break.
Kathleen Friedel. I'm a fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. First, I want to start with Arturo. My comments come from my experience as a proud precinct captain for Barack Obama during the California primaries in San Francisco, right on the border between Mission and Noe. And though I was proud on primary day, we lost. And we lost at the hands of Hillary Clinton forces, and it seemed very clear to me that the Latino organizations were well behind Hillary Clinton in that effort, although I thought we did better than we thought we would in San Francisco. I know that delivering voters as a bloc is an important political power, and that's a dynamic that's true for any number of interest groups. But I'd like to hear you place that power in conversation with the residential dispersal that Dowell and others have predicted, and whether or not Spanish language media will kind of retain the political cohesiveness of that of the Latino community. You know, as Latinos move from Pueblo, Colorado to Fort Collins, will they still be delivered as a bloc? And then I have some comments for David Abraham challenging this notion of the United States as a weak state. You mentioned that you were summarizing for effect, and I can appreciate that. The term I use is uneven, because along certain dimensions, the U.S. state is very strong. And there are two dimensions in particular that are very important, I think, to the immigrant community. And I'll summarize them as schools and soldiering. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. I'm a little bit of a zealot, and I hope to evangelize you into use of the word uneven, because I think it's important to not needlessly reify the concept of a neoliberal state, because it raises important questions of in whose state in whose interest the state actually operates in, and it also makes it possible to imagine, to use a phrase of Emil Durkheim, it makes it possible to imagine other ways in which the state might operate. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
A couple more before we turn back the pen.
Cindy Hahamovic's question for Arturo Vargas. I was just wondering if you could address the question of dual citizenship and whether you encourage your members to participate in the politics of both their home societies and this one.
And one more.
Hi there, Lorena Chambers, and I'd like to say I've had the incredibly good fortune of being trained in history by George Sanchez and David Gutierrez, and I work with Arturo now on the Census 2010. My question to Dowell is, we understand that not all immigrants are Latinos, of course, and not all Latinos are immigrants. And I wondered if, through your analysis, you saw some disparities between immigrant Latinos, non-immigrant Latinos, or is it really a parallel in terms of the economic opportunities that are coming forward with our community? One of the things that I find when I'm talking to friends on the Hill or to folks in that house around the corner that happens to be white is that 25% of all Latinos right now, or 25% of all kindergartners right now are Latino. So we have an incredibly huge number coming down our way, and it's not really a Hispanic problem or Hispanic issue, but it actually is a U.S. problem, right? Because when we have such
opportunity.
Okay, great. Well, we have 50% that don't graduate from high school, and then we go all the way down to maybe less than 6 out of every 100 Latinos that will graduate with a college degree, and they won't have the skills to take on these jobs, but we still have to clothe them, feed them, and shelter them, and they're not going anywhere, right? So I wondered if there's any distinctions between immigrants, Latino immigrants, and native-born immigrants, native-born Latinos. And then to Gary, my question is, do you feel that, or could you expand a little bit on how these notions of how Latinos are constructed in public imagery and narratives are feeding into, obviously, the anti-immigrant narratives that are going on? I mean, Lou Dobbs is the exception here. But is it because, like Arturo mentioned, new technologies, and so we have much more information being fed to us? Or is it, could you place into historical context, I guess, in terms of, is it really a huge hit in terms of the new technology, new social media, 24-hour cable systems, or is it really quite parallel to what's been going on historically on this anti-immigrant sentiment?
Arturo, do you want to start?
Sure. First of all, with regard to the California primary, some of the data I've seen also suggests that had no Latinos voted in the Democratic primary in California, Obama would have won that state. But Clinton won by over 1 million votes because she got about 67% of the Latino vote in California. Now, the notion of Latinos being delivered as a block, I think if they disperse, I think the first notion is, can they be delivered as a block, period? And I think being delivered as a block really depends on the circumstances of an election. What we've seen in terms of Latino voter behavior is that they will swing from one candidate to another, and they will not necessarily have an allegiance to a political party or to a surname. Remember, for example, the recall election of Gray Davis. There was a Latino on the ballot for governor, Cruz Bustamante, and Latino voters overwhelmingly voted for Arnold Schwarzenegger. So Latinos, I think, are much more sophisticated in terms of looking at the circumstances of particular elections and of candidates. So to say that they will be a block in every election, I think is not necessarily true, which, and from my perspective, in terms of being a self-interest and trying to have an influence in the political debate, being in play by both parties is helpful to trying to influence public policy. Now, with regard to dual citizenship, I would say that I'm probably more of a Neanderthal than my colleagues. I know there's globalization and so forth, but from my, again, selfish perspective, I want people engaged here. This is where people are being affected by policies. This is where people are being affected by how taxes are being spent and not being spent, what investments are being made and not being made. And I want people to focus on the impact of public policies on their lives here. I know full well that being able to influence, for example, elections in Mexico may have an impact on migration policies and the push factors or the pull factors and push factors, but in the more immediate, I want people to have an impact on their lives here. So to me, dual citizenship is a distraction.
Bill?
Well, let me just start by saying that we'll know that Latinos have arrived politically and been fully incorporated when husbands and wives vote differently. when you have that in every family, then you know you're totally immersed, right?
Let me think about that one.
Well, there's an argument in my family over who voted for Nixon and who voted for Kennedy, and my mother and father keep pointing to the opposite person, So speaking to the question about differences between native-born and first-generation Latinos, I focus on the first generation because it's the one that gets disparaged the most, and their progress is so dramatic over time. But there are clear differences with their kids. The kids are much better educated. I mean, far better educated. That's the biggest difference between the generations. But the first generation achieves homeownership levels that the kids can't even match, in part because the first generation got into the housing market earlier at a better time. Any poor kid coming along now, like my kids, they're not going to do as well as I did. It's harder. And so there's differences in terms of the period of history that people enter into the economy. And so people who arrived earlier, even though they were first generation, may be better situated. So it depends on each indicator. I mean, home ownership is different from education. Those are opposites. And the labor force is kind of in the middle there. The bigger question with Latinos is what happens in a third generation. That's where Tejas and Ortiz found a bigger failing. The third generation it becomes really murky. And what my colleague Harry Pachon says, that the reason that third generation doesn't seem to progress over the second, he blames it on intermarriage. He says, yeah, that stops their progress. Now, there's some technical reasons for that. There are some technical reasons for it, too, because, you can get to 50% intermarriage rates, and then that raises the whole question, what are we worried about? Actually, so looking down the road here, where the Center for Immigration Studies would have us believe there's 100 million more foreign-born, and they're trying to scare people with this big number. But down the road, it's all it's integrated. So it's not clear what is Latino and what's not Latino. But it creates the biggest problem for the data people, because we want people in nice, clear-cut boxes, so we can analyze them, and the quantitative studies then become deficient. So that's a vague answer, I think, on that point, but it's one that worries me because I don't know what a third-generation Latino is. I don't know what it is.
Could I start with something not directly addressed to me, but since I come from Miami, I have to say this. I mean, I think Portes and company are right that there's a kind of bifurcation here, and we academics, cultural commentators, whatever, the term Latino or Hispanic means different things to different people. I mean, in Miami, there is a population that is on the successful side, and it's not. It would be totally comprehensible that if we use the terms Cuba, Brazil, Argentina, and the like, but which make it seem anomalous. So there's a bifurcation, I think, and that bifurcation becomes a little bit clearer if we use national origin categories rather than an American-created ethnicity. But that question wasn't addressed to me. The one that was, I'm not much of a Foucauldian, but I think the idea of a left hand to the state and a right hand to the state is correct. America has, look at our prisons, look at our, the right hand of the state is quite strong. If the left hand of the state, on the other hand, of the social provision, it's not non-existent, but I think it is correct. The consensus view is correct that it's weaker than those of the states with which we tend to compare ourselves in other regards. A generation ago, the argument was made that the welfare state and the warfare state were imbricated, right? That's the LBJ period in American history, and just how were they imbricated with each other? Well, accumulation and legitimation were fostered by the same kinds of processes overseen by the state, but then it turned out that we didn't have to do that much legitimation, or at least not through welfare mechanisms, and that's the lesson of Reaganism, that the right hand can carry enough of the burden that the left hand can atrophy a little bit, although there is a penalty for forgetting your left hand, but it hasn't come up yet.
Gary, one last comment before coffee?
60 seconds. I don't think it's I'm glad you brought that up, because I think the issue with regard to Latino immigrants is not just the question of the undocumented. I think that fueling a lot of the anger about immigration is a fear of the Latinization of American society. I don't think it's primarily a technology issue, and one of the strongest statements of this comes in a very traditional form between two covers by distinguished political scientist Samuel Huntington, Who Are We?, arguing that America until now has had a model of Anglo-conformity that has worked, so that all immigrants coming into America have become part of this Anglo-conformity center, and the Latinos are the first group not to be able to fit into that. That is actually a very old argument in America. There's nothing new about that. And American history is full of groups who were once identified as unassimilatable and they could not be incorporated. And each of those groups so designated has proven the naysayers wrong. But I think what I see in the anti-immigrant fervor of today, I see a lot of that old nativism very familiar. I don't think it's, the technology makes its discussion somewhat different, but at its core it's a very old argument, and it has to be fought very publicly in America. That is kind of a hidden issue. It's not hidden to Latinos, I don't think, but most people will not talk explicitly about their fear of the Latinization of American society. And that is where a historical perspective, it seems to me, in terms of understanding the relationship of other groups once described as unassimilable, bringing that perspective to bear is really essential.
Before we break for coffee, please join me in thanking the panelists.